Production of this program was made possible by the John Templeton Foundation and is a co-production of The Ohio State University, COSI, and WOSU Public Media.
Good evening and welcome to In the Beginning, Explanations from Science and Religion. I'm Neil Conan from NPR News and Talk of the Nation. We've gathered at the Battelle studio at WOSU at COSI to talk about the tangled intersection of faith and evolution. We'll hear from a distinguished panel about their views on how the universe and life began, how they changed, and maybe even why they've changed. Dennis Lamoureux holds earned degrees in dentistry, theology, and biology. His appointment at St. Joseph's College is the first tenure-track position in Canada dedicated to teaching and research on the relationship between scientific discovery and Christian faith. He's the author of several books on the subjects we'll be discussing tonight. Eugenie Scott has been the executive director of the National Center for the Science Education since 1987. She's a leading critic of creationism and intelligence design. Brought up in Christian Science by her mother and grandmother, she later switched to a congregational church under the influence of her sister. Scott is now a secular humanist and describes herself as a non-theist. In 2005, Scott and other members of the National Center for Science Education staff served as consultants for the plaintiffs in the Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District case. Judge John Jones ruled against teaching intelligent design or creationism in the public schools as a result of that trial. Our next panelist, Francisco Ayala, was a member of the U.S. President's Committee of Advisors on Science and Technology from 1994 to 2001. In 2001, he was awarded the National Medal of Science at the White House. In 2003, he was appointed university professor, the highest title at the University of California, and he's currently the only professor holding that title at the University of California, Irvine. He has a long list of honors and achievements to his credit and has authored several publications. There's one especially intriguing title that we will no doubt discuss tonight, Darwin's Gift to Science and Religion. So let's begin the conversation. And Dr. Lamoureux, let me turn to you first. You're a proponent of evolutionary creation. What is evolutionary creation?
Well, it sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? And the reason that is so is most people, when they look at this discussion, they set it up in a dichotomy. In other words, you're either on the atheistic evolutionary side or you're on the young earth creationist side, the world was created in 6 days. I use the terms the way professional theologians and professional scientists use it. So when I'm using the word creation, the professional definition of it is simply this: the world was made by a creator, period. Now, when I get into the lab with my scientific colleagues and do some evolutionary biology, when we look at evolution, we simply see evolution as a natural process by which all forms of life emerge, period. So an evolutionary creationist is someone who is first and foremost, the noun, creationist being the most important term, one who believes in a creator. It just happens to be that the process is through an evolutionary one.
And evolutionary creation claims that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit created the universe and life. Any evidence for that?
That would be a religious statement to say Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That would be a distinctly conservative Christian position, obviously. Mm-hmm. To talk about it being scientific evidence, no, it's a religious statement of faith. When it comes to evolution, it is simply a natural process, and I'm going to do this again, period.
Okay.
Now, whether there's a God behind it or whether someone wants to make a commitment and say there is no God, that indeed, if you wish, is a religious statement, or I've got to use the technical term, a metaphysical statement. So we look at evolution and there's different ways of packaging it. My basic challenge ultimately would be to folks like Richard Dawkins who want to package evolution as being atheistic. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a step beyond the science. So an evolutionary creationist is definitely a conservative Christian who's looking at evolution and seeing it as God's process.
Dr. Scott, and this is a question I'm going to come back and ask all of you, but Dr. Scott, was there a turning point that changed your mind about creation, and what convinced you that God was not the explanation?
Oh, goodness. No. I can't think of one. I don't think anybody's actually ever asked me that before, Neil. No, first of all, I grew up in a liberal Protestant church environment. Very much enjoyed going to church, enjoyed singing in the choir, felt it was a very comfortable sort of place. I don't know, I guess I just gradually drifted away from faith. I think I just became interested in different things. I became a scientist. I don't believe it was science that turned me away from faith or anything like that.
You don't see any contradiction between the two?
No, I don't. Faith, religion, well, first of all, I should, people can get tied up with definitions, but definitions are important because what I might mean saying a term may not be what you will hear. You may have a different definition. So you have to remember that I come from this, toward religion from an anthropological standpoint. And when I'm thinking of religion, I'm trying to think of a definition that would work not just for all the different forms of Christianity or not even for all the Middle Eastern monotheisms or not even for world religions, but something that would work for the Hopi or tribal religions, something that could be used across the board to describe this extremely important human practice. And basically, to me, religion is the set of ideas and practices and beliefs that relate human beings to a non-material reality. We live in a material world, a matter and energy world, and we all recognize that. Most human beings believe that there is something other than a material reality that they can interact with, and it can be the home of God or the gods or the ancestor spirits or whatever your tradition is. Most human beings believe there is an existence, there is a reality like that. A minority of human beings, probably in every culture, probably back there in the caves, there was somebody thinking, I don't think so, but you don't mention it too often in most societies.
That's right, go along to get along.
Yeah, exactly. Or you get put on an anthill somewhere, and so you sort of don't. This is a much better time to be a non-believer than probably any other time in human history. But religion doesn't speak to everyone.
Religion does not speak to everyone, but it does speak to our next guest, Francisco Jose Ayala. And let me ask you, some people find a contradiction between faith and belief in evolution. Do you?
No, I don't. I think that faith or religion and evolution or science are like two windows through which you look at the world. You are looking at the same world, you are seeing different things. Science has to do with natural explanations, with the process that account for the natural phenomena. Religion has to do with the meaning of life, or purpose of life, life perhaps after death, moral values. These two things don't need to be contradictory at all. As perhaps you may know, and it may shock some others who do not know, not only I don't think that there is opposition in particular between evolution and religion. I think evolution is quite compatible with religion, while these ideas which go under the name of intelligent design and creationism are not compatible with religion.
Well, go ahead.
They are being proposed in the name of religion by people who either do not know enough theology or do not know enough science. In both cases, they do not know either one very well. The implications of intelligent design for religions are disastrous, because if we have been designed by God is a very incompetent engineer. We have a jaw which is not big enough for all our teeth, so they have to pull the wisdom teeth and they have to straighten the others.
But if I can interject, I practiced dentistry for 25 years, and I made a lot of money on wisdom teeth, so I'm grateful for that.
Well, so you should thank God for that.
Well, maybe God just like the dentist.
Now, I actually wrote a dissertation on teeth.
So there we go.
So this is
good on teeth.
let me then shift to another example. There are plenty of examples from implying humans. I mean, the birth canal of a woman is not big enough for the head of the baby, associated with the same process as the one of the teeth.
But with respect, you can pick out body parts, and as you know, the creationists pick out the human eyeball and say this is a perfection of design which could not possibly be achieved any other way.
The perfection of the eye, other than by design. Well, you only have to look at mollusks, which include the snails, the clams, and the octopus and squids. And you see there the gradation from very simple eyes, very simple, just a few cells in limpets, to very elaborate eyes like ours in squids and octopus. They have a camera eyes like ours, but they don't have a defect that we had. Because of the way the eye evolved in vertebrates, the nerve forms inside the eye cavity. So to reach the brain, to pass the information from the retina to the brain, has to cross the retina, which is how we have a blind spot. Octopuses and squids don't have this problem because the eye nerve forms in the outside, so it goes directly to the brain without having a blind spot. Proof definitive, according to the proponents of intelligent design, that God loves squids and octopuses more than humans.
Well, let me make Dennis Lamoureux uncomfortable with the same question I asked Dr. Scott just a moment ago. You were at one point in the creationist camp. What changed your mind? Was there an epiphany?
Let me tell you, I was in medical school at the University of Toronto in 1983, and I was wrestling with this issue. And I was a young Earth creationist, and I walked out of medical school to become a creation scientist to actually go after people just like this. The story's a long one. It's basically 13 years of graduate school. And, you know, I'm an evangelical Christian, and I will say that when I made this move, there was a sense of calling. But in that sense of calling, before I went to the Institute of Creation Research, and I wrote my letters to Duane Gish and Henry Morris, there was a sense of, if I was going to deal in this business, how about having a hard look at what's going on in Genesis, those early chapters? So I became a specialist in Genesis 1 to 11. And what happened was the surprise of my life, that reading Genesis is a lot more complicated than what I learned in my evangelical Sunday schools. And so the process started there, realizing my faith didn't move a bit. My approach to Genesis, I started seeing things I never saw before. And then following a degree in theology, a PhD in theology, there was still this wrestling with evolution. And I thought, well, what about doing a PhD in evolutionary biology in teeth and jaws, which is some of the very best evolutionary evidence? And I came in as under the radar as a skeptic, and after 3.5 years of seeing the data day in and day out, I learned two things. Number one, not all evolutionary biologists are raging atheists and mean-spirited atheists. In fact, the department head was Reverend Dr. David Payton, an ordained Anglican minister who was also an evolutionist. And then two, I went little by little, after 3.5 years of seeing the data, I just kept seeing more evolutionary evidence. At first, I was like the little boy at the dike. I could sort of block it out and give a counter-argument, and then it just kept coming over and over, till finally I just put my hands up in the air. And I'm not the only one who's said this and who's gone through this process. And you'll hear the O word from me, that the evidence for biological evolution is simply overwhelming. Now, the advantage I had to see that is I had this approach, and that was going through theology, realizing, and I'm going to give my faith. I believe the Bible's Holy Spirit inspired, and that the Holy Spirit went and inspired at the level of the ancient people. So in other words, was not providing modern science, but rather using an ancient understanding of nature. And from there, I was able to accommodate, if you wish, both my science and my theology, and look at evolutionary biology in the following way. And I ask this to Christians. You know, when you were being created in your mother's womb, do you ever think of the Lord coming out of heaven and putting on an arm or putting on a leg? I've yet to meet a Christian who said yes. Well, rather, we see ourselves in that wonderful Psalm 139 being knit fearfully and wonderfully together in the womb. And so I look at evolutionary biology in the very same way. Evolution is God's process through which we create. So I do the analogy from the womb to life overall.
Let me turn to you, Francisco Ayala. Was there a moment when you said, wait a minute, or were you educated to see that there was no contradiction?
I was educated to see no contradiction. I grew up in Spain, Franco's Spain. We had a dictatorship. The nation was officially Catholic. I went to a Catholic school. The first science class that I had was about the equivalent of about 7th grade in the United States, was taught by a priest, Father Pedro, and he talked about science in general, many subjects, and about evolution too. And never in my schooling there was any perception there was a contradiction between religion and evolution.
It's interesting. We mentioned the dates on which you served on the Presidential Advisory Board, which, of course, were during the Bush administration. I'm not going to draw any parallels to Francisco, Spain. Yet some of the people that you may have met on that panel certainly don't hold your views.
No. I served in the panel of advisors of science and technology during the 8 years of the Clinton administration.
Oh, you'll forgive me.
Yeah. I was presented the National Medal of Science by President Bush in the first year of his presidency at the White House. But the one with whom we worked, actually we worked mostly with Vice President Gore. On occasionally, the president will come to sit with us and be interested in some of the topics that we were discussing as advisors. But it was definitely Clinton, not Bush. And that group of people is a very interesting group of people. I think could be very similar to the three of us. We have a range of people from being top-notch scientists, 3 or so Nobel laureates, and several people who were quite religious, a couple of them at least, and most others who, in any case, did not see any contradiction between religion and science. So this issue of the apparent or perceived contradiction by some people between evolution and religion never arose there as a subject that required discussion. We were all in agreement. We would refer to it would be as a social phenomenon.
Dr. Scott, you've written that although Americans may doubt evolution, and public opinion polls tell us that a quite sizable percentage of Americans do, you think they are reachable. How?
Maybe one of my character flaws is an optimism that looks toward the future. I think ultimately, whether you accept or reject a scientific idea has to do with your understanding of the idea, and also has to do with what precepts you might bring in or already hold when you were presented that idea. In order to get people to accept evolution, they have to understand it. And what I find is that most people really don't know what evolution is. I have a colleague who teaches at a community college in one of the southeastern states, which I will not mention, and she told me that this is a college level class, so of course you teach evolution. Evolution is not controversial at the college level. It's taught routinely at every university, including places like Baylor and Brigham Young and Notre Dame and places like that. And but she had these students in her class who had never learned anything about evolution. When those chapters of the book came up, the teacher just kind of passed over them and went on to other topics. But this is college, so she just taught evolution matter-of-factly. After a couple of weeks, a couple of these students came up to her and said, well, of course species change through time. You mean that's evolution? We thought evolution meant you can't believe in God. And I get this regularly, not just from high school teachers, but I even get it told it by college teachers, and I'm a former college professor myself, and I ran into that idea. The big idea of evolution is that living things shared common ancestors, that there is this huge genealogical tree of life that relates all living things together. That is in direct contradiction to one religious idea that God specially created everything in its present form. Indeed, if that's your view of creation, evolution isn't going to work for you. But as my colleagues who are both Christians have pointed out, there's more than one Christian view. And actually the best kept secret in this whole controversy is the majority of Christians, Catholics and mainstream Protestants, accept evolution as the way God did it. So I think what we need better understanding of what evolution really is. Mm-hmm. We also need better understanding of the difference between science and religion, which is sort of what we're working up to here on this panel. But we also need, I think, more theological understanding. I think most people don't really understand the view toward evolution that their own denomination holds.
Well, Dr. Lammer, let me turn to you, because to some degree this is also a reaction of people saying, you are telling me what to believe. You are telling me I must believe this, and I don't hold with that.
Yeah, and I respect that, and I never tell people what to believe. I mean, my pedagogical technique or teaching technique is as follows. I want people to see the range of positions. I want them to know that there's important people holding all these positions. Then I want them to make an informed decision. To me, that's the way I teach at university. And, I'll give you an example. When it comes to the teaching of evolution, I want the scientists in the major universities, and I think the vast majority do, to simply teach the science. But as Jeannie points out, if they're bringing in the metaphysics or a certain philosophy and collapsing them together, I have no trouble with professors saying that to their students, but not to say that this is evolutionary theory. Let me give you an example from my class. I had this absolutely delightful young woman. My first 3 weeks of the class is, here are what the terms mean. And I teach in a Catholic school within a public university, the University of Alberta, so I have a range of students. She raises her hand, and she says, well, before I start off, I want you to tell you that I don't believe any of this Jesus stuff. I said to her, that isn't a problem. You're within a university. I will defend you to make those statements and defend the case. And she said, I'm a double major. I'm in paleontology and honors evolutionary biology. I am an atheist. And now that I've been introduced to these different categories to suggest there are different forms of evolution, I'm aghast at how a few of my professors come into science class, teach evolutionary biology, and overlay it with Richard Dawkins's form of atheism. Mm-hmm. And she says, what they're doing is they're baptizing evolutionary science with atheism. And you could have heard a pin drop because all the religious kids in the class going, yeah, this does occur. So effectively, and I think Jeannie and I get along so, in terms of our categories of the discussion. Let them teach the science. I have no trouble with the professor saying, this is what I believe, but do not, and I'll use the technical term, do not conflate or collapse evolutionary theory with a certain atheistic, secular, or agnostic worldview, and at the same time, don't conflate it with my Christianity as well. Separate the science from the religious beliefs.
Yeah, the thing is, the nice thing about science is that it's really an equal opportunity substratum for all kinds of philosophical ideas.
Yes, ma'am.
Now you can, somebody like me or like Richard Dawkins will look at the evidence from science and say, we believe that this supports a conclusion of materialism, that there's only matter and energy operating in the universe. Somebody like my friend Dennis or like Dr. Collins would look at the evidence of science and evolution and say, that supports his idea or their idea that there is an intelligence in the universe, that there is a creator God, that there is meaning and purpose, etc. My only argument is that neither side should say that science compels either of those conclusions. Yes. Because I think that's doing damage to what science is all about. And to me, it's just sloppy philosophy of science. Yep. Because like Francisco was saying, science is a way of explaining the natural world, and we restrict ourselves to natural causes in explaining the natural world. Not because we're all a bunch of atheists, because we aren't. Some of us are, not everybody is. But because we don't have a theometer, all right? We don't have a way of controlling for or holding constant any sort of actions of God. Whatever experiment you set up, if you try to use God as part of that explanation, you're not going to get anywhere because any result of that experiment is compatible with God's actions. So, lacking the theometer, we just have to leave God out. And to say nothing of God is not to say that God is nothing, as Robert Knapp says.
Exactly. If I add, Jeannie and I could go in the lab, we could come out with the identical scientific results. Mm-hmm. But then when we go to faculty club and start saying, what are the religious or philosophical implications? That becomes a completely different discussion. We'd end up at different conclusions, but the science is inert in that regard.
Would that it be? Francisco?
Well, I think they are correct. I certainly agree with everything that either one of them has said, almost word by word. But however, there is possibly a positive relationship between science and religion. Religion, faith, can be a motivating force to study the natural world and trying to understand the world as the creation of God. And for a scientist who studies the beauty of the natural world, it can be a source of religious inspiration. So the two fields of knowledge or of human activity, I think, can interact positively in the sense explained. The problem arises when we enter into the notions, the concepts, in the way of explaining and accounting for things, because, again, saying it once more, science deals with natural causes, with what happens in the natural world, what explains the natural world. Religion deals with meaning, purpose, our relationship with God and with each other. They're completely different subjects. So there can be a positive feedback of sorts, but neither science explains religion, nor religion explains science, and it's better to keep them aside in that sense.
Well, you were president of the Society for the Study of Evolution. How do you study evolution?
I was a professor at the University of California in Davis. Interestingly enough, it was while I was president of the Society for the Study of Evolution that the state of Arkansas passed the famous or infamous law, statute as it was called, which required to teach creation science whenever evolution was being taught. Now, nobody had heard of creation science before. The statute itself, the legal law that was passed in the last day of the legislature in the state of Arkansas with 15 minutes discussion, defined what creation science. And there were 6 statements taken from the Bible, as if the Bible were a textbook of biology or of astronomy. So anyway, that statute was passed, and as a consequence, as being president of Evolution, I was the first contacted by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, to try to plan a strategy as to how to deal with this statute. And eventually, as you probably know, it was challenged in the courts. Another thing that was going on at that time, I was also already a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and there was a new president of the Academy, and I went to him to tell him, this is a matter in which the Academy of Science should pronounce itself. And Frank Press, who had been science advisor to President Carter, was then the president of the Academy, and he told me, I think for dialectical purposes, he said, well, why should the Academy get involved in a particular field of science? And I told him, I do remember almost exactly the words I said, this is not about a particular field of science. This is about the survival of rationality in this country. If we require that something which is not science be taught as science in the schools, then it's a big step backwards. So I was one of the experts witnessing the trial in late in 81. And as you may know, and just to remind those of you who know and to tell those who do not know, we expected the state of Arkansas to appeal the decision against the state of Arkansas. The state of Arkansas decided not to appeal, much to the disappointment of the Society for the Study of Evolution, the Academy, the ACLU. Fortunately, in a way, the state of Louisiana had passed a statute which was exactly the same, word by word by word, and the judge in the federal court in Louisiana decided he was not going to hold the trial because it was identical statute as the one in Arkansas has already been declared unconstitutional. But the state of Louisiana appealed, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court and was decided as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court.
And this went on to intelligence design in the Dover case. And I want to ask you, we know how that case came out too, the same side. Nevertheless, critics will say, what is your problem with teaching competing ideas? You have your ideas, they have their ideas, teach them both, let the students decide.
Absolutely. Nothing wrong with teaching competing ideas. But we're talking about what do you teach in a high school science class? And that's the big distinction. In a high school science class, you teach the consensus view of science or history or mathematics or whatever. You don't teach opinions, right? You don't teach that either the earth revolves around the sun or the sun evolves around the earth and let the students decide. You present the consensus view of science. Heliocentrism is here to stay. Trust me on this one. In biology, living things had common ancestors. That's the consensus view of science. It is not the consensus view of science that either evolution happened or everything was created as we see it in its present form, which is the special creationist point of view. Now, if the intelligent design proponents or the old creation science proponents wanted to present their ideas to the scientific community, argue them in the professional meetings, argue them in the journals, argue them in the body of scholars, and try to convince them that, in the case of intelligent design, something like irreducible complexity or complex specified information, these other buzzwords that they use, are really legitimate ways of explaining biology. They have that opportunity. Science is open to new ideas. If somebody can come up with an idea that really shakes the idea of common ancestry, that'll be fabulous. We'll have a whole bunch of new research to do. It'll be really, really exciting. Evolution isn't a belief. It just happens to be a really well-demonstrated science, which is why it's taught at the university level and why it's taught at the high school level. And until the intelligent design people are able to make their case that they have a valid science, they don't deserve to be taught at the high school level.
Yet this allows your critics to portray you as opponents of academic freedom.
Exactly. Yeah, it's an extremely clever strategy. If you don't have the science, go for the culture. They don't have the valid science, so instead they're arguing on American cultural standards of fairness and academic freedom, and we'll just let both sides be heard, or let all sides be heard. Well, you know, we don't present that in a history class that Lee surrendered to Grant and Grant surrendered to Lee and let the kids decide. We just teach them straightforward history.
I was going to turn to you
with regards to intelligent design. As I went from my young Earth creationist phase, I was loosely attached to these guys back in the mid-early 90s. Phil Johnson, Mike Behe, Dembski, Bill Dembski, Steve Meyer. And I might add, some people will say they're charlatans and such. I will defend these guys. They are true believers. They're genuine spirits. I don't agree with where they end up. But the one thing that I've seen with this group, and Jeannie is absolutely right, science starts with certain ideas that are outside the pale. Fair enough. But they've had 15 years now to present the intelligent design theory, and I'm still waiting for that theory to come forward. At that 94 meeting, it was in Cambridge at the C.S. Lewis Summer Institute. It was a who's who in science and religion. It still remains the best two-week conference I've ever been to. I always remember William Lane Craig, who's an evangelical philosopher and theologian, one of this country's and the world's leading apologists, asking Michael Behe, as he was, this is 94, so Black Box came out in 96. And Bill said to Mike 3 times, well, if it's not evolution, what's the theory? If it's not evolution, what's the theory? If it's not evolution, what's the theory? And 3 times Mike didn't provide a theory. So I'm still waiting to find out what's the theory. Now we hear a lot of things like irreducible complexity and the famed flagellum and things like that. But is that indeed the theory? Are you telling me that we need this divine intervention with regards to the first cell? If that's the theory, then put it in print and let's debate it. But it's not there and it's not clear. Now, as a theory, and I will defend these guys as a possibility, let's say there is that one event that God put the cell all together, from there everything evolved, which, by the way, interestingly, is Michael Behe's theory. Michael Behe's an evolutionist except for that first cell in Darwin's black box. And if that indeed is the case, that is what is called the God of the gaps. And we have a track record of people proposing divine events to account for things. For missing information. And what happens is science goes on, that information gets found, and the gap gets closed. Now, if ID and the first cell is true, this is what we're going to find from biochemistry. The next generation of biochemists will say, there's no way molecules could self-organize into the cells. Then the next generation after that, you see, instead of the gap closing, the gap's going to widen and widen and widen. I'm waiting to see the gap widening. And what's happening to evolution in terms of, ask any good molecular biologist. Have we figured out how molecules turn into cells? Oh, goodness gracious, we're a long ways away from that. But have we figured out bits and pieces and parts of it? We have. And when it comes to this famed flagella or flagellum, we have bits and pieces of how that came about. So My concern with intelligent design theory is, number one, it's really not out there clearly, and number two, it's a god of the gaps, and we have a historical record. The gaps have always closed.
That is about the
Francis.
flagellum. We have more than bits and pieces.
Okay, correct me on
The
that.
evolution of the flagellum has reconstructed in great detail all the genes that were involved. First of all, there is not such a thing as the bacterial flagellum,
Right.
because each bacteria had different forms of flagella that serve different purposes. But in general, and for all of them, has been reconstructed gene by gene, duplication of gene, interaction between genes, going down to the present-day flagella. So this has been done originally in two very profound papers, one published in the magazine not known as Nature, the other one in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and afterward this evidence and arguments have been repeated and clarified in many ways for the general public. So actually all the examples used by Michael Behe, who's a bona fide biologist, as has been pointed out. He's not really an evolutionist, he's a biochemist. Yeah. But all the examples that he uses in that book, some of them, the evolutionary history was already known in detail. He didn't know it. And the other cases have been reconstructed completely. So he does not use any longer those examples. In my way of looking at this matter, first, what you were saying about why don't we want to teach alternative theories? My response to that is, our children, our young people, receive a very poor education in science. The last thing we can afford to do, is to teach them something which is not science as science. And to make the point, I ask people, would you want them to teach alchemy together with chemistry, and astrology together with astronomy, and witchcraft together with medicine? Obviously not. We want to teach, as Jeannie was saying, the scientific consensus. And I will go further with respect to evolution. Being an evolutionist, of course, I'm passionate about the theory. There is no scientific theory at present that is as well corroborated as the theory of evolution, because it has happened that as various disciplines of biology have come about, things like neurobiology, what is called evo-devo, evolution and development, and particularly molecular biology, these disciplines were not looking for evidence for evolution, but are providing the strongest evidence for evolution. And so we are in a situation where, challenging now the theory of evolution as a scientific theory makes no sense. If somebody comes with an idea that would make sense, as Jeannie says...
well, let me just try one more shot at this, and that is that the critics, the creationists, and the anti-evolutionists say, wait a minute, you don't let us speak at your colleges. You don't let us write in your publications.
Wrong.
You exclude us.
Wrong.
Okay.
We do. The thing about the academic life, and I'm an ex-college professor, I'm a former president of a professional scientific society, I know how these things work. Most associations of scientists have meetings. At those meetings, they're pretty free-form. You can present a poster or a paper if you can write a coherent abstract. In physical anthropology, we actually have one or two individuals who come to our physical anthropology meetings and present papers on Bigfoot. Now, Bigfoot is not a real popular topic among physical anthropologists. You're not going to find but he can write a coherent abstract. He has ideas about footprints or fingerprints or something. He can present these papers. He can try to draw around him a group of people who would be willing to do research on this topic, and maybe he can build a movement. This intelligent design people can go to their biochemistry meetings and their molecular biology meetings and their information theory meetings or whatever. They can go to their professional associations. They can present their ideas. When you present your ideas are going to get shot down by your opponents. I mean, sometimes when I'm at a campus, I'll say, raise your hand if you've ever submitted a paper for publication. A whole bunch of papers go up. A whole bunch of hands go up. Keep your hand up if all of your papers have been accepted. And there's a big, roar of laughter and all the hands go down. Nobody promises you a rose garden. The field of scholarship is not easy. You actually have to have something substantial to say. You have to support it, and you have to fight for your ideas. The intelligent design folks have the right to do that. They are not. Instead, they're going to the op-eds and they're going to the school boards.
I want to take that even one step further. If any scientist or any person who knows science would develop a scientific theory contrary to the theory of evolution, which is well argued, that scientists will get the Nobel Prize. They will be celebrated, glorified. There is nothing that we like more in science than finding an argument against something which is generally accepted. Of course, science develops in a tentative way. Those things which are tentative at the time become firm later. You know, I have been in the last few years working with the parasitic protozoa, which causes diseases like malaria and Chagas. I have turned around some of the general concepts that were accepted about how these parasites reproduce and how they live and how they function. Nobody has shut down my ideas. On the contrary, they are celebrated. Scientists want to have contrary ideas so long as they are argued scientifically with good evidence and so that they can be accepted as scientific ideas.
And can I follow with a specific example from vertebrate paleontology? I work in a laboratory. Most of my time is spent doing theology, but I still do some evolutionary work on evolution of teeth and jaws. I'm in the laboratory with Mike Caldwell, the chair of biology at the University of Alberta, and he's a mosasaur specialist, which is an aquatic reptile specialist. And there was a conference in Iowa a number of years ago, and Marcus Ross, who is a young earth creationist from Liberty Baptist University, was giving a presentation. And Mike's a non-theist, and Mike point-blankly said, and I saw the email, that Marcus will be allowed to present his ideas and that he didn't want any disrespectful rhetoric with regard to that. To say that they're not given the opportunity, I mean, he didn't convince anyone. In fact, he didn't engage on it. There were a few people asked questions, but it didn't go much from that. So, like Dr. Ayala says, you know, scientists would love, put it this way, Jeannie, wouldn't you love to find a human molar down in the Cambrian? I mean, let's say you and I want a human...
Really
that's right. No, if we found a human molar down in the Cambrian, and this is what a word of exaggeration, we'd turn all of science upside down, wouldn't we? I mean,
we sure would.
And it's not like it would be hidden. I mean, and there's the scientific community is massive, and I guarantee if there was that one human molar down there, everyone would be there, and the books and the money behind that, I hate to be cynical, the money behind that would be spectacular.
You know, just to shift things a little bit, I think a lot of the problem with religious opposition to evolution really is religious opposition to the idea of being able to explain things through natural causes. And it's really misunderstanding what science is all about. And we keep hammering away at, we're trying to explain the natural world using natural causes. That's true of cell division, that's true of explaining Chagas disease or parasites, and what it's true of explaining how to straighten teeth. That's true of all of science. But when people try to explain the origin of all living things on Earth and how we got this lovely diversity of creatures and where human beings came from and our relationship to other organisms, when you try to explain that kind of thing by reference to natural causes, that's when people get all upset.
Well,
and they shouldn't, you know, because that's just the way you do science. I've often asked conservative Christians who have come up and spoken to me after lectures, because they always bring up the idea, well, you haven't discovered the origin of life, therefore evolution didn't happen, which is really not the case, because even if we don't understand a step-by-step way of getting from inorganic chemicals to that first reproducing cell, we still have common ancestry. Once you get that cell, from then on it's evolution. And we're not dependent upon a natural origin of life for evolution. But what I say to them is, okay, let's just say 2 weeks from now, let's say that somebody in a laboratory someplace comes up with a really plausible series of events going from inorganic molecules to organic molecules to something that can reproduce to something that can reproduce within a membrane, a first cell. Would that mean there's no God? And they'll say, of course not. That's the point. Just because you can explain something with natural causes doesn't mean there's no God.
Dr. Lamoureux, let me ask you, you're the one here who currently teaches students, some of whom come like that young girl who was an atheist, but some of whom are not. and they will see this evolution as an attack on their way of life.
Wow, you've teed it up for me. I teach exclusively science and religion. And if I had to describe the average student that comes into my class, it's a student who's got a religious background, a personal faith, and a good portion of them want to go to med school. They want to go to the next program. They've got to go through the biology department, and they need a lot of A's to get to the next program. Mm-hmm. Evolutionary biology, sure, you've got the fossil record, but you want to know where the greatest evolutionary evidence is occurring. It's in that gentleman's discipline right there, genetics and molecular biology. So if I had to describe the average student, and I love these young men and women, they are compartmentalized, and I'm not dissing them, they compartmentalize for their own psychological safety. They're seeing the evolutionary evidence, on one hand, in the laboratories and in their university education, and they're working hard at it to get their A's. They're having their Sunday morning experience, but in their Sunday schools there's this be suspicious of evolution, but they've also got this faith. How do they do it? And you know what I find so amazing? In basically a 13-week course, I can show them, and again, not simply my position, a variety of different models of people who have done both the science and the theology and are very faithful to say, here's how you can do it. And so they can integrate. And they know intuitively they don't want this compartmentalized worldview. And in simply 13 weeks, I read these papers, and I know when I was their age, I could never process. They're absolutely brilliant. And they put it together. And they're basically doing it in the way that all three of us, and remember, I think what's great about this panel is, remember, Jeannie is a non-theist. And this makes sense to her categorically. And it can be done.
Francisco Ayala?
There is no reason why being a scientist should be incompatible with being a person of faith, or accepting science being compatible with accepting faith. As I said earlier, I think that one can be a source of inspiration for the other. But I want to go back to the statement that I made in passing before you asked me or gave me the opportunity for it, that, you know, with intelligent design, you have this problem of the imperfections. It's not imperfections. It's that in the world of life there is dysfunctions, there is cruelty, there is oddities. Parasites can only live by killing their hosts. So it seems like somebody has to be a sadist to have designed that. Well, sometimes when I try to explain to people, including my students, when they ask me questions about this, well, but that does not excuse God of being, responsible for these things. If these things occur in the world, ultimately God has to be responsible. My view of that is that the theory of evolution, in fact, solves what the theologians call the Theodicy problem. Why there's this kind of evil in the world? Because cruelty, when you have a troop of baboons, which usually is a group of females with a dominant male, and then many of the females are breastfeeding the babies, if that dominant male is killed or dies or is removed by some other dominant male, the first thing that the new male does is to kill all the babies. Now, that is favored by natural selection, because by doing that, the females go all into estrus, and then the male fertilizes them, and the babies are going to carry his genes. So any genes that move him to kill the babies will be favored by natural selection, because they will multiply more. So attributing, the design of organisms to God, to me, amounts to blasphemy. Now, some people say, well, but if God has not done it, it's still one step removed. I don't care with they say that my explanation is, this is something has been said by William Dembski, is like saying the God is not responsible for the evil in the world, because you say that he has not designed it, but he's the creator of the world. It's like a mugger that comes with a wild dog, and rather than killing his victim, has the dog killing the victim. And that's not so, because, you see, baboons are not moral subjects. Parasites are not moral subjects. They cannot cause evil, So if the actions they do are not caused by an agent, specifically designed, then they stop being evil actions. They are just phenomena of nature. There is no morality in the actions of a baboon or a parasite. So that eliminates completely this problem of the presence of evil in the world. We don't have to explain evil in the world by somehow creating a theology that accounts for it. Simply, there is no moral evil in
Counts
the
for
world
the
of
evil
life.
in baboons and parasites, not among
Yeah,
people.
there still is human suffering. I mean,
there's human-
theodicy problems out there.
One thing that Theodicy did well is explain, at least in certain Christian traditions, explain human suffering and human sin, because you have
fundamentalists have got a easy explanation. God gets off the hook. It's Adam and Eve's fault.
I think more general explanation in Christianity, certainly in the Catholic tradition, but also in others, in some of the mainstream churches, is that God could have created robots rather than humans, but they would not be very interesting beings. It's much better to have humans that we have freedom. Now, having free will has as a consequence that we can do good or we can do evil. Now, when we do good, we earn, our eternal reward, as it were, that way. There's the doctrine. We do evil, we'll be punished. Now, if God would have created robots, there would not be human evil. No, there would be no moral evils. It would not exist, but that would not be, first of all, an interesting world. Second, it certainly will be not real humans. The same with the rest of the animal, world, and in fact all of life. God would have created a world that did not evolve, fix. But that will not be a very interesting world. The world in which we live that evolves, where new species appear, new kinds of organisms, new relationships, new ways of life. I mean, the evolution of life, as I was saying earlier, can be a great source of inspiration for religion, for a religious view of the world. We have to keep them apart.
Creates problems,
but
though,
it creates problems, but it can be a source of religious inspiration. So God is responsible for the evil in the world that comes from evolution? No, because that evil is no longer evil because they are not moral subjects. God could have created a world that didn't evolve? Yes, but that would not have been a very interesting world. I'm happy that we have free will and that the world evolves. It's much more interesting.
I used to say that I didn't go into science because I never did well in the courses in which there was only one right answer. And now I suspect I just didn't study it long enough.
Well,
but
we're not talking science here.
No, I understand that.
Just to say with a parenthetic note, did you notice the interesting dialogue that started emerging here? The problem of evil in the world, with a loving God. Where is this loving God? Now, that's a challenging and great question. And that's one of the questions we have to wrestle with.
Actually, if I can just, because this is something that I was thinking of when Francisco was talking too. If you're going to be a religious person, your religious views have to take into consideration the real world. Yeah. I mean, if you're going to have I'm not a believer, but I hang out with a lot of theologians, and they will tell me that if you're going to have a real meaningful theology, it has to accord with what we know of the natural world. So obviously, science has to inform religion. Now, where we run into problem is with something like creation science, and I would argue also intelligent design, which is where people are saying, well, the theology has to inform the science. The theology has to tell science how the real world is. That's not the way science works. We muddle along best we can trying to explain things using natural causes, not supernatural causes, not God. Because it happens to be a very good way to find out, and a very reliable way, and a way that ends up with providing very good explanations of the natural world. But theology has to consider science. And not all theological views are concordant with what we know of science.
What have we learned from this challenge? What have you learned specifically, Dr. Scott?
The challenge of science.
Creationism and intelligent design. Have you learned anything from the critics?
I have learned some good things, but mostly, I don't know how to put it. What I have learned from this dialogue is a very sad situation, the one that we are confronting in the United States, because we are creating a problem, a conflict, where there is no need for conflict, where there should be, if anything, collaboration and mutual reinforcement. And the problem exists because we have very poor scientific education and we have very poor religious education, because even the proponents of intelligent design could benefit of taking a few courses in theology. You know, they will learn things that they don't seem to know. So what we need, how to deal with, to solve the problem, more education in the schools, but also once people leave the schools, the media, the press, the radio, television, should play a role in continuing education. And certainly with respect to science, that does not happen in this country. It does not happen really in any country, seriously. But it does not happen in this country, and we are the leading country in the world in matters of science and technology. You know, how many pages you see dedicated to science every day in the main newspapers? Nothing. I mean, you have 6 or 8 pages dedicated to sports. You have probably a quarter page or half a page to the horoscope. But science does not get anything. I mean, you have some exceptions, you know, the LA Times has, the New York Times has on Tuesdays, 4
Science
or 5
Tuesday,
pages, Science Tuesday. But this is the exception. It's very, in occasion, all newspapers publish an article about some newly discovered thing or whatever.
Don't forget
but
celebrities.
And celebrities too. You need continuous education, and it would be wonderful if the media would pay more attention to the needs to educate the public with respect to science.
Production of this program was made possible by the John Templeton Foundation and is a co-production of The Ohio State University, COSI, and WOSU Public Media.